Hey, Nicole, welcome to Drunk Comics. Thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
So, start things off. Do you want to tell me a little bit about yourself and where you're from?
We currently live in Florida between Tampa and Orlando. I teach full-time and I tutor part-time. And then I'm a mom all the rest of the time. Well, I'm a mom all the time. Whatever. It works out.
We're
and
moms 24/7, unfortunately.
Mom is first, but then, well, then mom's to everybody else too. That's kind of what it ends up being. I'm like a mom to the kids in my classroom and the kids I teach. So it works out.
Are you the mom friend in all your friend circles too?
Yeah, but I'm the mean one. And I don't know, that's all I do. That's all I do.
That's a lot. That's a lot. You also do Reels and Heels.
Yeah, we do the podcast on Saturdays at 2:00. And we're part of our HWWS Hanging with Web Show family. So our broadcasts happen on their YouTube channel as well.
So how did you get into comics and superheroes?
I was dating my first boyfriend and he was an X-Men fan. And so there were a handful of comics that he would either tell me about or I would read. And I was like, well, these are really cool. And I used to love the X-Men cartoon in like 90, 92, 93. So it was normal for me to read X-Men. So I was like, well, that's easy. And so that was kind of like my jumping off point. And then he bought me The Crow. And then he got me hooked on Strangers in Paradise. And so I was reading like that stuff. And then I read a lot of tarot. And then when Brian and I got together, he was kind of a comic, like he was all across the different kind of comics. Like he read a lot of them and had a lot of just not any one title, just like a lot of comics. And we ended up going to Comic Cons and stuff like that because we just really loved the pop culture aspect of it. And I started reading some of the other stuff too, but I was always more into the MCU and just the superheroes in general. It just kind of was fun for me. And so I wasn't reading a lot of comics because I was becoming a teacher and then teaching. So everything I was reading was revolving around whatever my kids were reading.
Yeah.
And I finally, I was teaching in Vegas and my kids were struggling with reading on grade level because at that time I had ESOL kids and I had 8 languages in my classroom. Oh. And the only language we had in common was English. Wow. So I looked for anything that I could possibly bring in with pictures. And so I started using Heinleigh's picture. They'd have these abridged novels with pictures in them. And then they had, for the really beginner kids, they had pictures with sentences underneath them. And so the kids were like really excited about finishing a story because it was like a true news story, but it had the pictures that went along with it. And it was easy enough for them to read. And so they'd get really excited about being successful. And so we started with that. And then they started reading the comics that were just on the shelf in my classroom. And it kind of went from there. And when I moved to Florida, Brian's like, well, we go to all these conventions. Why don't you just start talking about it? He said, we know enough people that would give you panel time. Let's just talk about it. And I was like, well, I don't feel like I know enough about it. So I started reading up on using comics and the pluses and the pros of having comics just in your classroom, but not just in your classroom, having it be stuff that the kids could talk about. Have it be part of your literature circles and part of your instruction. And so I got really interested in that, and we started kind of like, he basically, I always call him my pimp. Like, Brian is my pimp. So I will never say it. Like I will never say it. I will never go out and say, I can do this and I can do that and I want to talk about this. I'm not going to do that. But Brian will talk to someone who wants to talk to me. And so then I end up talking about it because I love it. And people are like, why don't you do this? And so they'd like book me for the shows and stuff. And I would stand up there and I'd be nervous as all get out, and then talk, just talk about something that I was passionate about, because I believe that the characters have something to say, and it's good storytelling and it's great vocabulary, and it joins two incredible mediums together. And so like I would just ramble on like a crazy person, and people would come and listen to me talk. And I was like, it started with 6 people in the room, and then there were 15, and then there were 20. And I was like, I'm famous. Like, this is awesome. Like, people are coming to listen, and they're like doing it in their classrooms. And we're talking about books that we can share and like ways we can teach it. And I was always super excited. So, and I'd been talking about it for a couple of years. And finally the principal was like, or the assistant principal at one of my schools, she's like, well, what do you want to do after testing is over? And I was like, I don't know. She's like, well, what do you want to read? She's like, I got some extra money, I can buy something. I said, well, I want to read a comic book. And
That's so exciting.
she's like, well, which one do you want to read? And I'm like, I don't know yet. Let me figure it out. So I talked to all of my friends that were in the industry, like that were comic fans and comic book, just geeks, and everybody that was excited about whoever. And they had like a short list of books that would be easy to get my hands on and okay for them to read. And I could get my hands on the X-Men book that I'm going to talk about. And then I had a friend that could get me the Superman book. What was the book called? Oh, Superman Red Sun. And
book.
I couldn't find enough of the Red Sun books. And so that one kind of fell through the cracks. But then I handed her this book.
Yay.
And I handed her this book, and she said, I don't have a problem with that. Like, how long do you think that you can teach it for? And I said, I can probably teach it for the last month of school. And she's like, well, how do you have a way that we can get a hold of it? And I said, well, it's a PDF online. I'm going to get sued for copyright someday. So it's a PDF online. And she's like, this is awesome. So I downloaded the PDF, and I printed the PDF in black and white for my kids. So I had 13 copies of the PDF in my classroom.
Holders, don't sue. This was for educational purposes only.
Yeah.
Made.
Don't sue me. The kids never sold it. I didn't profit off of it. I don't have pictures. I don't have lesson plans. I don't have anything.
Yeah.
I just have memories, And so the kids were like, oh, we're going to read a comic book. And so I had the color version that I could project on the screen.
This makes my heart
And the kids were they were super excited. And I told my principal, I was like, there's only one problem. And she's like, well, what is it? Because of course she didn't read the book. She just was like, sure, whatever. So she's an African-American, assistant principal. And I was like,
assistant principal.
Well, the book has the N word in it once. And she's like, oh, you're going to have to white it out.
Oh my gosh. Awkward.
So I was like, well, there's just this one problem. So and it's a key point in the book, so you can't really white it out. And I don't really like to censor stuff anyways. Like, I think it should be a talking point.
Right.
So it's this scene in the book. And so it's when the guy when Danny calls her a mutie, and Stevie comes out and says, they're just words, child. Like, it's fine. And she says, you wouldn't be so tolerant if they called me a nigger lover. And she was like, oh, you're gonna have to white out that word. And I was like, okay, if it means I can read the book, cool. And so I took every copy that I had and I whited out the word. I didn't put anything in it. I had 6th and 7th graders at the time, so you can only imagine how that went, because Miss Jobin didn't censor anything. So they're like, what is this? What is going on? She whited something out. There's something bad under here.
Yep.
So I got kids in the back of the room scraping off the whiteout. And I'm like, you guys, you can't do that. And they're like, well, why not? We want to know what's under here. Because you're only going to white out the stuff that's bad. And I was like, oh my God. So I was like, well, we'll have to get through the book. You have to read it with me.
That's what happens with censorship. Basically.
Well, I can't white out the color copy on the screen. Like, what was she?
Oh no.
The color copy has the word in it. And I'm like, okay, so for this purpose, I said, we're not going to say the word, but we're going to acknowledge that the word is in the book. And so when you see Stevie say it, the kids were like, wow. And I was like, do you know why she said it? And they were like, because that's kind of like a bad word, really. Like, you know, it's not a nice word. And I'm like, well, you're right, it's not. And I said, so why did she say it? And they're like, well, because isn't Muty kind of like that? And I was like, exactly.
Yeah.
And so the kids were they started having these really awesome conversations. And I was like, these kids are really kind of smart about this stuff. But, you know, I worked in a school where we were super diverse. And so my classes were essentially 40% Hispanic. And then the rest was split between my African-American students and my white students.
Oh, wow.
So we had a lot of diversity in our classes. And so when I was sitting there talking to the kids, I said, we really have to talk about this in terms of mutant and human and the problems that come from that. But I said, we could really think about this in the way of race too. And so my kids were talking about race, and they were talking about Martin Luther King, and they were talking about Malcolm X, and they were reading about all of these people that were in history that they've been likened to the characters. And so I read tons and tons and tons of articles about this book being like the civil rights, you know, era book, and how Chris Claremont wrote it essentially for that, because there were so much turmoil and tumultuous times during the 80s. So my kids just like, they saw the word and they kind of like freaked out. And then they were like, well, we kind of get it. And so this book held their attention until the very end of the book, when Stryker got real weird. Like the end of the book just got too much for them to really be able to understand. And so it stopped being about Magneto and Professor X, and it started to be more about Stryker and the military. And so the kids weren't really as interested in it then, but they kind of held on to the whole Kitty Pryde thing. Like, you know, they kind of held on to her, and they really, it became huge. Like this comic, not only did it change my life, but I feel like it changed the life of my kids sitting in that classroom that day. Because when they saw the word on the screen, they were like, oh my gosh. And my white kids were just as like blown away by it as any other kid sitting in my room. And they're like, well, how can anybody say that? And I said, well, why did people say it? Like, let's talk about it. Let's talk about why this is a big deal. And so after that, I never heard another kid call their friends by that word ever again. Like, it just became something that they didn't do. And it was just nice to see how that changed them. And it changed my opinion on what kids could comprehend and try to understand. And while we weren't doing a lot of standards-based stuff with it, we discussed a lot of stuff with it. And we talked about how they were similar to these characters in history and how that time period was so, you know, volatile and scary and meaningful, you know, like, but we figure our kids understand racism, and they don't know jack really about it. Like they know it happened, but they don't have an idea of what the struggle was. And so I told them, I said, you know, you got to kind of think of it as the fact that I am a white teacher telling you about this, but I'm a white teacher who still gets goosebumps when I hear Martin Luther King speak. And this movie and X-Men X2 came out.
Yeah.
Right around that same time. And that's what they're both based on it. So like this book is, I think, pretty much this whole movie.
The movie really adapts that book pretty well.
And it really is it's a pretty good adaptation. There are some things that are definitely wrong with it, but I think any adaptation we were getting in the 90s and the early 2000s was, you know, not as beautiful as we were hoping to get. But and I think now, like, there's no possible way that we could have had all the X-Men running around in yellow spandex. It just wasn't going to happen. Well, I'm glad that it was, you know, adapted the way it was adapted. There are problems with it, sure, but it gave us something to kind of hope for. And I think it hit all of us that grew up in the 90s watching that cartoon. And falling in love with the X-Men kind of gave us something to fall in love with again.
You want to give a bit of a rundown of the story of the comic? Like,
so you kind of meet, well, you don't really, how do I explain it? So the opening of the book starts with Magneto finding a couple of kids that were strung up in a playground. And he says that it's the most terrible thing when these kids were only, you know, abused and murdered because they were born, like essentially because they were mutants, and they were labeled muties and they were left for dead. And so Magneto says something very Martin Luther King, very Malcolm X like, in the fact that
Magneto's
that
Malcolm
everything X. Pretty much with whatever power is necessary, these people will pay. And so it kind of really puts people at odds. So it puts Magneto at odds with this group of mutant haters and the Strikers Crusade, and then kind of pushes Professor X to be on TV to explain, you know, that they're just people and they shouldn't be treated any differently. And so there's a whole beginning with Kitty Pryde. And I think maybe right around this time I was kind of understanding Kitty Pryde because she was trying to figure out who she was in this world. And she was trying to strike out her own, and she was trying to figure out how she could be the best person she could be while also being a mutant. And I think that was the biggest thing in this book. And this is what the kids, I think, took away from it too, was that she was fighting for everything she was possibly to, you know, to give somebody else. And so you kind of see Stryker's movement, and then you hear Professor X kind of introduce the X-Men and talk about the gifted school. And Stryker is basically just trying to get the airtime to sound like he really cares about the humans. And Kitty Pryde gets into a fight with one of the kids who calls her a mutie. And she goes at it kind of with her teacher, her dance teacher. And she says, you really could have hurt the boy. And she says, you know, he deserved it. And her brother says she didn't mean what she said, because she, at this point, she says, if you would have called me, what would you have done? If they're just words, what would you have done if he would have said to me that I was a, you know, N-word lover? And Stevie says they're, you know, whatever. And she's very upset. And there's a couple panels that my kids really had to look at. And I think they're powerful panels. And she says, she didn't mean, Kitty's upset, Stevie. She didn't think about what she was saying. She didn't mean it. And they walk away. And Stevie says, of course she did, my friend. She meant every word. And then Stevie says, she's right. And so in the meantime, there's all these people trying to pick up the mutants and try to, like, basically force them into submission. And they meet back at the house, and they get into this, you know, just this knockdown, drag out brawl. And in the meantime, you know, Magneto's kind of working in the background too, to try to, you know, have his side heard. And Stryker's got this movement to make sure that his resistance is, you know, that he meets the mutants head on, ultimately culminating in a political debate and a fight, basically to the death. And it happens in a very public forum, and, you know, and it basically has her screaming, "We're more human than you are." So he singles out Nightcrawler, and he says, how do you dare call this thing a human?
Poor Nightcrawler.
And Kitty Pryde comes up and says, we're more human than you. And there's this whole, like, she goes on this, like, basically has a soliloquy. She said, Nightcrawler is generous and kind and decent. He has every reason to be bitter, every excuse to become as much of a demon inside and out, but he decided he'd rather learn to laugh instead. I hope I can be half the person he is. And if I have to choose between caring for my friend and believing in your God, then I choose my friend. Nice. And I mean, they basically stand united and look down the barrel of this gun and say, we're not gonna give up on our friends. We're not gonna be less than, you know, less than what you think that we are. And there's this whole, like, angry mob that happens, and they go back to the house, and it's just this amazing, like, exchange between Magneto and Professor X, and then the rest of the group at the mansion. And it basically comes down to Magneto saying, you all agree to this? And he says, I see. And you, Charles, do you subscribe to your students' insanity, or will you join me? And he reaches out his hand and he says, I can't. Like, there's that like, that whole, I can't go along with what you're saying, because what you're saying is wrong too. Like, the only way we're going to get to know them and to get them to understand us is if we're better. And Magneto refuses, and that essentially just becomes kind of that feud between them. And it really sets up the entire rest of the story for the argument they have. And just, it's this, like, really poignant tale of, I really feel like it tells the civil rights movement in a way that keeps people from being, you know, inundated with race. Like, it took race out of it, and it gave us a way to talk about something that was very important at the time in a way that people could listen to it. And right. It's still a pretty relevant book even to this day, I think. Like,
I agree.
It still shares so much realness about what we face.
Is there anything else you want to say about the book?
It is not a book that I've read with my kids yet. But it will definitely be a book that we read together at some point. I think that when I first read the book, I was like, wow, there's so many things that we could do with it. And when the kids were reading it, they took it to a whole nother level. And I just feel like if our kids are open-minded enough to care that much about a character in a comic book, then we owe it to them to talk to them about it. Like, we owe it to them to be honest about, where we sit on the issues and to help them understand. Like, I always thought I had things figured out for myself until I became a teacher. And then I was like, there's so many other ways to look at things, and kids will come to you and say the craziest stuff. And they're like, I don't care what color you are. Like, I'd have a handful of kids. Maybe in the 15 years I've taught, I've had maybe 5 that were outright bothered by the fact that I was white. And the rest of the kids were like, no, you're super cool. You love us. You put up with our craziness. Like, it didn't matter what color I was. It mattered about how much heart I had. And so we don't give our kids enough credit. Like, put the book in their hands, put comics in their hands, and you'll see where they're at.
You're such a good teacher. Talk a little about what you've done with comics and in the classroom.
Like, in the classroom. So it kind of became, so the joke is that Brian is my pimp, and he pimps me at the Comic Cons, because I would never have said anything. Like, I would have seriously just done comics in my classroom, and that's just where it would have been. Like, I would have always had comics on my shelf. It would have always been a subject that we talked about. It would have always been a medium that I would have even showed a panel or 2 or whatever, because it was so great, the amount of learning that came out of that, not just the story, but the vocabulary, the facial expressions of characters, what eyebrows do, what speech bubbles are. I mean, it just taught so much to my kids. But I tell everybody that Brian's my pimp, because he'll pimp me out to conventions and say, my wife talks about this as a passion project of hers, and she really wants to get teachers on the same page. And so for the last 3 years, about 4 years minus COVID, I'd been speaking at conventions around Florida, just talking about the importance of getting kids reading, and by opening the windows, into comics, to allow kids not just, superhero comics, but other forms of the graphic novel, genre, into the classroom, both in the way we teach and in just on our shelves and as choice reading. And I think my prayers have kind of been heard, because both of the textbooks that we're talking about adopting in our district they both have a section on graphic novels.
Yes.
So a lot of us have rumbled enough that it's starting to get some acknowledgement. And so our kids are probably saying too that they need that visual perspective too. So I've been talking about comics in the classroom for 4 years. There's tons of other people that talk about it. I am not the only one. And it just kind of became a passion project, with something that I was doing in Florida. And I was talking to Sean Daly had interviewed me 2 years ago, 2 years ago this week, on his show. And it also made syndication on the list.
Yeah.
On
ABC.
ABC's The List or something, I don't know. And so, I made, a little teeny little, United States news. It was a little national, but it wasn't anything really to write home about. But I just keep on talking, and I keep on telling people if we can build a big enough, universe of us that believe that, then we could start writing, lesson plans to share that are more than just discussion prompts, because the world we live in is very much a testing society. So we have to be able to teach the standard so that it can be tested later. And that's where we're at. So if we don't have our kids doing that, then our kids are learning by reading it, but we also have to prove it in the classroom. Like I have to say, hey, the standard has been taught, and I taught it with this amazing graphic novel.
Yes.
So that's kind of where we're at. Like I love the medium. I love what it teaches. I love the vocabulary. I love the characters. I love that it tells so much more. It's like when my kids find out that I'm a geek, they're like, who's your favorite? And I was like, well, it started out as Batman. It quickly moved to Rogue, and it very much ended up with Captain Marvel. And they're like, are you serious? And I'm like, yes. I said, because Captain Marvel is essentially a metaphor for my life. Like, there's that whole montage where she falls down, and every time she gets back up, she dusts herself off and she keeps on moving forward. It's like,
and I
that's
like now that you can say the super kids, but I like the thing that Captain Marvel gets back up, not because it's the heroic thing to do, but because fuck you.
Yeah. And I think that every little girl that's ever been told that she couldn't, yeah, we'll drink to that.
My glass never but cheers.